March 1944, Monte Cassino, Italy. A German paratrooper leans back against cold rock, rifle across his knees. Below him, the Rapido Valley is black and silent. Above him, the shattered monastery watches over everything like a broken tooth against the stars. He isn't afraid. Why would he be? His division, the 1st Parachute Division, are some of the best soldiers in the German army. They've held this mountain for months. Bombers have hit them. Artillery has hit them. Nothing has moved them yet. He's heard the rumors, though. The other men talk about it in low voices when the officers aren't listening. Small soldiers from Nepal. Curved knives. Men who climb where nobody else can climb and kill without making a sound. He laughs it off. Everyone does. Just another campfire story to frighten the new recruits. Then nothing. No gunfire. No shouting. Just silence and a shape moving through the dark that shouldn't be there. And by morning, some of the toughest men on that mountain will start refusing to walk sentry duty alone. This is the story of the Gurkhas, at Monte Cassino soldiers, so feared that entire German positions quietly changed how they operated at night, just because of them. But here's the part almost nobody tells you. The same hillmen who would go on to terrify Hitler's paratroopers had spent years being dismissed by their own side. Written off. A relic from the age of empire, not a weapon for modern war. To understand how that changed, we need to go back to why the battle for Monte Cassino was already being lost. By early 1944, the road to Rome ran through one mountain. For over 100 miles, the Germans had turned Italy into a wall, the Gustav Line, using rivers, minefields, and the Apennine Mountains themselves as weapons. Right at the center of that wall sat Monte Cassino, a 1,700-foot rock crowned by a monastery, founded 14 centuries earlier, watching every road below like a loaded gun. Whoever held that mountain held Italy. Everyone knew it. The Allies threw everything they had at it. American troops crossed the freezing Rapido River in January and were cut down in the water. British and Indian troops climbed the slopes in the snow and were thrown back down them. By February, an entire New Zealand corps had joined the fight, and still nothing moved. So the commanders made a decision that would haunt this campaign for the rest of the war. On February 15, 1944, 250 bombers turned the ancient monastery to dust, 1,400 tons of bombs in a single morning. The thinking was simple. If you cannot outfight the enemy on that mountain, erase the mountain out from under him. Here's the problem nobody wanted to say out loud. The bombing didn't just fail to break the German defense. It made everything worse. Picture it like this. A smooth wall is easy to climb over. A pile of broken rubble is not. Every collapsed archway became a firing slit. Every crater became a foxhole. The bombs had turned one target into 1,000 hiding places and handed every one of them to the German paratroopers for free. The Germans hadn't even been occupying the monastery before that morning. That same week, Allied infantry attacked into the wreckage anyway. They were slaughtered for almost no ground at all. Among them, Gurkha riflemen of the 1st, 2nd Gurkha Rifles, sent forward into a fight that firepower alone was never going to win. To understand what happened 1 month later, you need to meet the soldiers everyone kept underestimating. The Gurkhas came from hill villages across Nepal, some walking for days just to reach a British recruiting station, competing for a small number of places against thousands of other young men. Nobody drafted them. They fought for the right to fight. For more than a century, the British Empire had used Gurkha regiments in almost every corner of the world it controlled, and for just as long, much of the military establishment had quietly filed them away as a curiosity. Fierce, loyal, excellent in the hills, but not a real modern army. Not next to tanks, not next to bombers, not next to the industrial machinery of 20th century warfare. Their signature weapon didn't help that image. While the rest of the Allied war machine ran on steel and explosives, Gurkha soldiers still carried a curved, wooden-handled blade, called a Kukri, the kind of weapon that looked like it belonged behind glass in a museum, not on a modern battlefield. Plenty of senior officers saw it exactly that way. A relic, a ceremonial oddity, charming on a parade ground, surely useless against the Wehrmacht. They had already been proven wrong more than once. In the trenches of the First World War, in the North African desert where one Gurkha company summed up an entire firefight in 9 words on a report. Enemy dead, 10. Own side, none. Ammunition used, none. Read that again. 10 men killed. Not one bullet fired. And still, by the freezing spring of 1944, standing below Monte Cassino, they were treated as a backup plan men to send at a mountain only after the real weapons had already failed, which is precisely what had just happened in February. And it's precisely why, in March, once the tanks were wrecked, the bombers were spent, and the generals had run out of modern ideas, someone finally turned to the primitive option, not out of respect, out of desperation. That decision would change everything that followed. The plan for March was almost embarrassingly simple, and that's exactly why nobody had properly tried it before. Forget the road, forget the obvious approaches, the ones the Germans had spent months turning into a killing field of machine gun fire and mortar rounds. Instead, climb the mountain itself, from the side nobody believed was climbable. In the pitch dark, without firing a single shot. On paper, it sounded close to insane. Soldiers of the 4th Indian Division, Gurkhas among them, would move up a narrow, twisting goat track toward a position just a few hundred yards from the monastery, in total darkness, on a slope so steep that one loose stone could send a man falling for 100 feet. No tanks could follow them up there. No artillery could easily support them. If they were spotted, there was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, and they weren't planning to shoot their way up. Here's the simple version of why. At night, a rifle is basically a flare. The muzzle flash lights up your exact position. The crack of a single shot tells every German soldier within half a mile precisely where to aim next. One bullet fired doesn't just risk one life, it can get an entire unit killed in the seconds that follow. So the German outposts guarding that goat track had to be taken by hand, silently, one hairpin bend at a time, moving upward, using a blade where a rifle would have given away everything. To the officers back in London and Washington, drawing grand strategies with arrows on a map, it must have sounded like something from the century before. Knives against the Wehrmachti's most decorated paratroop division, climbing a cliff face the Germans themselves hadn't bothered to defend properly because they assumed no one could climb it. It was the kind of plan that gets laughed out of a briefing room, except it worked. On the night of March 17th, a single company from the 1st Battalion, 9th Gurkha Rifles, did what 4 divisions and 1,400 tons of bombs could not. They climbed where nobody was watching and came out the other side less than 300 yards from the monastery itself. The Germans hadn't just underestimated them, they hadn't even seen them coming. What happened over the next few days broke something in the German line that no bomb ever could. This wasn't a normal battle. There was no wall of noise to hide behind, no clear front line to defend. The paratroopers on that mountain had trained for years to handle artillery barrages, machine gun duels, tank assaults, the loud, visible language of modern war. Nobody had trained them for silence. And silence is exactly what the Gurkhas gave them. Sentries who should have called out a warning simply didn't. Positions that had radioed in 20 minutes earlier went quiet and stayed quiet. Somewhere out in that darkness came a deep, hollow thump, a blade finding its mark, and then nothing. No scream, no shot, just wind and rock and the slow, sick realization that the enemy was already standing inside your line. Stories about the Gurkhas had followed them up from earlier campaigns, quiet accounts of enemy camps where men were found marked but deliberately left alive, as if to say, "We were here, and we chose to let you live." Whether every version of every story was exactly true almost stopped mattering. By the time this reputation reached Cassino, the legend was already doing half the Gurkhas' work before a single man set foot on that mountain. Fear like that doesn't behave like fear of a gun. You can hate a gun. You can shoot back at a gun. You cannot shoot back at a rumor. German soldiers who had stood firm through weeks of bombing started breaking a much older rule of soldiering: never let your imagination win. Men doubled their watches at night. Men refused to patrol alone. Some, according to accounts that circulated for years after the war, slept with a blade of their own close at hand, not because it would help against an enemy they couldn't see, but because doing nothing at all felt unbearable. The paratroopers defending that mountain were, by any honest measure, some of the finest infantry in the German army. Monte Cassino did not go badly for them because they were weak. It went badly because, for the first time in this war, they were afraid of something they couldn't see coming, and couldn't hear until it was already too late. Now here's the tragedy hiding underneath that victory. Just 1 month before Hangman's Hill, this same 4th Indian Division, including Gurkha riflemen of the 1st, 2nd Gurkha Rifles, had already been thrown at this mountain once, except in February, they went in after the bombing. after the generals had bet everything on firepower instead of patience. They fought their way toward the base of the mountain under murderous fire, straight into a battlefield of broken stone that the bombs had just handed to the defenders for free. They were driven back. Heavy losses. Almost no ground gained. The bitter irony is hard to sit with. The commanders who ordered that bombing believed, sincerely, that they were saving their soldiers' lives by using overwhelming force first. Instead, that decision very likely cost some of those same lives by skipping past the one approach that might have actually worked. Patience, stealth, soldiers willing to climb in silence instead of walking into rubble in daylight. 1 month later, when Gurkha riflemen finally got the chance to do it their own way at night, on foot, blade in hand, on ground the Germans had assumed was safe, they achieved, in a single night, what 4 divisions and over 1,000 tons of bombs had failed to achieve in a month. They reached Hangman's Hill, named for a gallows-shaped pylon standing over it, less than 300 yards from the monastery. And then, for 10 days, they held it. Cut off. Surrounded, running low on food and ammunition, drinking water from a shell crater that turned out to have a dead mule rotting in the bottom of it. Supply drops, meant to save them, fell into German hands instead. Tanks that finally fought their way up the mountain track in support were wiped out in a single German counterattack. No further reinforcements ever came. On March 24th, what remained of the Gurkhas were finally pulled off that hill. By the time the wider battle around them ground to a halt, the division had lost close to 3,000 men. They had proven the plan worked. The war around them simply wasn't ready to follow through. Monte Cassino itself didn't fall until May 18, 1944, 4 months, 4 battles, and by some estimates nearly 200,000 casualties after the fighting first began. It was Polish soldiers who finally raised their flag over the ruined monastery. After German forces had quietly withdrawn in the night, their line broken somewhere else along the front. But something had already been decided back in March, on that freezing, silent mountainside. The Gurkhas never got their storybook victory at Hangman's Hill. No triumphant photograph, no headline back home, just an exhausted withdrawal, and a hill that nobody could hold for long on either side. And yet, from that mountain onward, something had permanently shifted on both sides of the line. Allied commanders who had spent years treating Gurkha regiments as a colonial curiosity started requesting them by name for the most desperate assignments left in the Italian campaign. And in the German ranks, the fear that had started as a barracks rumor hardened into something closer to standing orders. When the mountain goes silent at night, you do not walk that ridge alone. So think back to that paratrooper at the very beginning of this story, rifle across his knees, laughing off the campfire tales about small soldiers from Nepal and their curved knives. He wasn't wrong that his division was among the best in the German army. He wasn't wrong that they'd survived bombs and shells and everything else the Allies could throw at that mountain in the open light of day. He was only wrong about one thing. He assumed the war would keep making noise, right up until the moment the man standing behind him made none at all.